Okay, so welcome back to yet another session. So I want to pick up from where we left off, but before we do our practical sessions, I thought that I should do an overall summary of functions so that we best understand what functions are just before we delve into our practical session. So another way program flow can be altered is by calling a function. So the calling statement usually directs the program execution to branch off a certain function. So remember we talked about loops and that kind of thing. So those are branch off statements or controls from a particular program. So if you do this, you are trying to own the program using particular statements called functions. So once completed, the function returns the control back to the original code. And functions basically are similar to what we call subroutines. We shall see that later, or methods in other programming language, just like the ones we've seen. We've seen loops, we've seen control flow and that kind of thing. So just a similar thing. So you could think of functions as any of those. So looking at functions, like we said, it controls the program flow, but then functions are similar to subroutines, like we said. It controls returns from the function back to the original code. And then we're saying that you could as well write your own function. That's very possible. But there are thousands of functions that are available that could help us basically build our functions. So all functions have a type. We said this can be our syntax. So this is just the anatomy of a function. All functions have a type, they have a name, and they also have arguments. And these are usually stated on a line by itself. So this usually is one line. So you have a type, name, and arguments, and then your function type reference is followed by what we call the parentheses. But one thing you have to note is that every function has a type, and the type is the value returned from the function. And this is usually followed by the name, and this is unique for every function. So it cannot be the same as a keyword or a particular variable within the code. So it should not share the name with a keyword or any other name of a variable within your code. That's something to take note of. And then functions have 0, 1, or more values passed to the function. So you can pass no value or 1 value or more values to a particular function. I hope that is okay. But then you can also have inputs or arguments to the function, right? Inputs or arguments. So these are inputs to the function. And then you can also have a statement block belonging to a particular function. That anything that goes in within here is a statement block that belongs to the function, and it's usually enclosed in the braces. So these basically follow the function's definition. I'm going to say that shortly. So looking at this example, this is an example of a function, void function with no arguments. Void function with no arguments. So here, the alpha function has no inputs. So you notice it has no input or output. So it's alpha void. There are no inputs or outputs, right? Which is valid in C language. So it's valid for you not to have an input or output. That's okay. Okay, that's okay. So yes, right there. That's okay. So I can proceed. I was just saying that this example, looking at the void alpha void function example. In this particular example, we have no input or output. And we're saying that this is okay for any, or this is valid in a C language. Therefore, it's a void function. Considering this particular function, you're going to call it a void function. And void in C language, I mean, void is a keyword considering a C language, and it also has a data storage type, or you can say if anything is void, it means you're keeping nothing. So it's a valid storage type. It means that I have no storage type, and because the function has no arguments, you notice void also appears in the argument list. So in this case, for our type, we have nothing kept or stored in it, but we also have no arguments. We have no inputs or outputs for this particular function. So this function returns no value. It's a void type, but its name is alpha right there, and it has no arguments. They're also void. That's why we're specifying void for that function. Considering this other example, this is an integer count void function. So it's an integer function with no arguments. So function count is an integer function, and it generates or returns an integer value. So it generates or returns an integer value right there. Generates or returns an integer value, but it requires no inputs, and therefore it has no arguments. That's what we can see right here. That's what we can see right here. So the function returns an integer value, like we saw, this function, and the function's name is count. The function has no arguments, that's why we specify void. I hope that is clear. Let's look at yet another example. So this next example, we're looking at the function hang up. This function, so we're saying this is a void function with one argument. Earlier on we had an integer function with no arguments. Now we have a void function with one argument. When we specify void hang up character ch, so this particular function hang up returns no value. It returns no value. That's why it's called a void function. So this qualifies to be a void function. It does, however, accept a single character as its input, and the character, this particular character, is what we're calling an argument, and it's referenced within our function as variable ch. We're going to see that in a bit. Let's look at yet another example. So here is our grade function. So we have a void function. Void function returns no value, but has two arguments. Two arguments. The previous examples had each one example. So I mean one argument. So looking at the void grid, int a, int b, it means that this is a grid function that accepts two values, int a and int b. So variables a and variable b. So we're saying that a function can have unlimited arguments. So this example shows us that a function can have unlimited arguments to itself or by itself. John has raised up the hand. It's okay. John. Yes, John. Just unmute your mic.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. How are you? Yes.
I'm fine.
Yes. You have a question?
I was just, I was just requesting for your opinion on the void function with the one argument.
You're requesting for? Yes. Yes.
No, pardon.
On.
On the void function with one argument.
Is it that one? Void function with one argument. This one, yes?
Yeah, that
Yes.
one.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, so we're saying this is a void function with one argument. So it's possible to have a function which is void. So that means there's no return value. You notice we don't have int. The value, there is no value. There's no return value. It does not return any value. When you say void
yeah,
int, right? It means it does not return any value. So the function hang up returns no value. And that's why it's called a void function, right? It does, however, accept a single
yeah.
input, which is a character. Is it okay?
Yeah.
And it's referenced as the
Yeah,
ch. So our variable in this case is ch, which is a character. Is it okay?
yeah.
It's okay. Can we proceed?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, that's okay. So you can just mute your mic as we proceed. So it's also possible to have a void function with two arguments. So this follows from the previous example, the hang up example. So this is a grid function, and we're saying this is a void grid int, which takes in variables a, which is an integer, and variable b, which is an integer. So this is yet another example of a void function. Void functions return no value. Please take note of that. If you say void and then you specify the function, it means there's no return value for that particular function. That's one thing to note. I hope that's clear. So every time you say void and then specify the function name, it means that particular function does not return any value. But if you put any arguments or values um, in within your braces, it means that is the value, the input value that particular function takes in. So for example, the grid function takes in values of a, which is an integer, and takes in another value of b, which is an integer. So for this function to fully work, it has to accept or take in these values. We shall see that later. Looking at the function details, we're saying that the function's arguments are used within the function using the same variable names mentioned in the argument list. So we're saying that when this particular function is executed, that function can access the variables presented in the argument list. And these usually use the same names as specified in that particular list, and all variables used in the function are local to that function. We shall see later in the practical session. So another thing to note is that all other variables that are declared within the function are local, like we said, and their values only exist when that particular function is executed. And the function cannot access variables that are used elsewhere within the code. Take note of that. Functions cannot access variables that are used elsewhere within that particular code. Rather, it only uses the local variables. So, function stops when its final statement is executed. The very moment the final statement is executed, the function stops, but then control is returned to the calling statement. the function call, we're going to say that functions that return a value are required to use the return keyword. So if you expect that a function should return a value, then you use the return keyword to return a value that is required for that particular function. So that means that function passes the value back to the calling function or to the function call. So the return keyword can also be used to leave a function before the last statement is executed. We'll see about that. You can also use return by itself to end a particular function. Remember when we said return 0 for the main function, it means the execution of that program ends at that point. And we also saying that functions in C are usually stored in the C library, or that those that are stored in the C library, like the get character and so many others that we've seen. So looks like everyone is able to access it. And if you're able to hear me clearly, please type 2 before we proceed. Okay, that looks good. So this is just an example. And we're saying that all functions have and use at least one function. All functions have and use at least one function. So there usually is at least. So you notice that every time you're writing a C program, you say int main. So why we said at least one function, it means there is that one function that has to be written for the program to execute. And by default, we have the main function, and that makes it at least one function. The main function is where the code basically, or code execution starts. Like all C functions, the main function has the data type. The main function has a data type. So any function we said should be having a type, then the name of the function, and then followed by arguments. So the main function has a data type and also could have variables within. Font size a little bigger so that everyone can see. Sorry about that.
It feels like we're in heaven. If it will get dark, you'll be my million stars. I know I can lean on you. Oh, you catch me like a leaf falling from a tree. If I'll be a shooting star, you make a wish. No, I don't fake this kind of feeling. Never felt so real.
How about that? Is that okay now? Okay, I think we're good to go, so we can now proceed. Okay, so someone has issues with configuration. We shall deal with that later. Don't worry. We'll deal with that later. So back to our example. We said hash includes standard input dot h, and this is int main. Right there with a block of statements, and the block of statements is printf. I am the main function, so we expect this to be printed onto our screen, and then return 0 for the return type function. So back to what we're supposed to talk about. We're saying that all C functions basically use at least one function, and by default every C function, every C program uses the main function. Like I said, every C program uses the main function. And this is exactly where every program execution starts. And we're saying like any other, the main function has a data type. So in this case, we're saying int main that. right? And we're saying that this data type that you declare, okay,